Step into the unknown with us here at Paranormal M. We bring you stories that will make you question the very fabric of our reality. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications to stay up to date with our latest mind-bending tales. We hope you have a thought-provoking time listening. Creepy Doll Forest. As I was visiting my mother, we got into a heated argument. I was only 15 years old at the time, and as any teenager would, I ran off in anger to a nearby forest. After wandering for a bit and calming down, I decided to explore the area, as I had rarely been there before. I took a few paths and eventually stumbled upon a clearing where I thought I saw someone. I cautiously approached, only to discover that this person was actually chained to a tree and wearing an orange construction worker vest. My heart sank as I realized that this was a real person who was in distress. I panicked and ran away, but as I was fleeing, I saw more people hanging from trees. It was a horrifying sight, and I knew that I had to tell someone about what I had just seen. I raced back to my mother's house and told her everything. At first, she was skeptical and thought that I was just imagining things. But after I pleaded with her and begged her to come with me to the forest, she finally relented. We made our way back to the clearing, and when we arrived, we were both stunned by what we saw. The people hanging from the trees were actually life-sized replicas, complete with clothes under their construction vests. It was a bizarre and unnerving sight, and we couldn't help but wonder who had put them there and why. We decided to investigate further and search the surrounding area for any clues, but we found nothing that could explain what we had seen. It was as if the replicas had simply appeared out of nowhere. To this day, I'm not sure what to make of that experience. Was it a prank or something more sinister? I may never know for sure, but it's a memory that stayed with me all these years. Creepy old music box. I remember the day I went to my girlfriend's house for the very first time. It was an older house, and they had recently moved in. As we entered the house, I couldn't help but notice its unique features and its old-fashioned charm. At that moment, everything seemed pretty normal, and I didn't think much of it. As the evening progressed, we talked and flirted with each other, enjoying each other's company. But then out of nowhere, the light suddenly went out, plunging us into total darkness. At first, I thought it was just a power outage or something. But then I noticed a strange feeling in the air. It was almost as if the house was trying to tell us something. And that's when it happened. A few seconds after the lights went out, we heard a sound of an old music box coming from the corner of the room. We both froze in terror as the box played on, revealing a frickin' ballerina figure from her dead grandmother. It was creepy beyond belief, and we both knew that something strange was certainly happening. From that moment on, we both felt like we were being watched. We couldn't shake the feeling that something supernatural was happening in that house. We started to put things on top of the music box to prevent it from playing anymore, and we never saw or heard anything strange again. But even though we never experienced anything else out of the ordinary in that house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking in the shadows, waiting to reveal itself once again. And it's a feeling that I still can't shake off, even till this day. The Pale Lady Standing in Torrential Rain. As a person with a deep interest in the paranormal world, I recently joined a sub to discuss and learn more about these fascinating topics. I've always believed that spirits, both human and inhuman, exist, and I've heard numerous stories of encounters with them. However, I never expected to experience something like this firsthand. It was June 30th, 2014, in Calcutta, India, when my father had been in an ICU for nearly a month in a semi-conscious vegetative state due to meningitis. We had been struggling to keep up with treatment costs, and the doctor had informed us that there was no hope. As a result, we decided to move him to a renowned government hospital. However, the hospital discharge formalities took several hours, and by the time my dad was put into an ambulance for the shift, it was already evening, and the heavy rain had begun to pour down. My sister, cousin, and my father were in the ambulance, while my uncle and I followed them in a car. We had to cross a junction that usually had heavy traffic, so we decided to let the ambulance go first, as the cops would allow it to pass. My uncle and I took a U-turn to take a different, slightly longer route, with lesser traffic, hoping to reach the hospital before or at the same time as the ambulance. As we continued down the road, we noticed an old lady standing almost in the middle of it. Her skin was as white as paper, and she was wearing a white saree while holding a thick walking stick, which appeared to be more like a branch of a tree. She was staring in the direction where the ambulance had gone. It was a strange sight to see, as all the shops were closed due to the rising level of water in the street. The water had risen so much that our driver couldn't take his foot off the accelerator, lest the water might seep in through the exhaust. Both my uncle and I saw the old lady, but we didn't talk about the experience until a couple of days later. We were still puzzled about what we had seen. Who was she? Why was she standing in the middle of the road in such heavy rain? Her pale and white skin was something I'd never seen before. Sadly, my dad passed away on the 13th of July. Until this day, the memory of that old lady haunts me. I've always believed in spirits, and this experience has only strengthened my beliefs. I wonder if she was a spirit, or was it just a coincidence that we saw her on that particular day? Perhaps she was trying to tell us something. Whatever the reason, it was an unforgettable experience that I'll always remember. I saw a shadow entity last night. I can still remember that stormy night vividly. It was around 3 a.m., and I was sound asleep in my room when the loud thunderclaps jolted me awake. I turned over in my bed trying to shake off the sleepiness that still hung over me, but then something caught my eye. There was this massive mirror facing my bed, and I saw a black mass halfway blocking it. At first, I thought it was just a sleep hallucination or perhaps my groggy mind playing tricks on me. However, as I stared at the black mass for a moment, I realized that it was real. I kept my eyes fixed on it for a minute, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. As I gazed at the black mass, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest and my palms began to sweat. The longer I looked, the more frightened I became. However, I couldn't look away. It was too curious and too afraid to break the gaze. After a moment, I decided to shut my eyes, hoping that when I opened them again, the black mass would be gone. I did just that, and when I opened my eyes again, I saw that it had disappeared. I could see my full mirror now, where before I could only see half of it. As I sat there stunned, I realized that what I had just witnessed was a shadow person. It had just used the thunderstorm to manifest itself into our reality, and it had chosen my room to do so. The experience left me feeling rattled and disturbed. I couldn't believe that something like this could happen in my own room. However, at the same time, it sparked my interest in the paranormal, and it led me to learn more about shadow people and other unexplained phenomena. To this day, I still think about the night and wonder what would have happened if I had reacted differently or tried to approach the shadow person. Would it have disappeared? Would it have harmed me? These are questions that will always linger in my mind, but I'm grateful for the experience nonetheless. It's opened up a whole new world of possibilities, and it's made me a believer in the supernatural. Ever been in the woods when all the birds stopped singing? I remember the first time I was playing disc golf with my friend on a public golf course in Lockport, New York. As we made our rounds through the course, I noticed something strange happening around me. A couple of times throughout the trip, I observed that all the birds had stopped singing, and everything that made noise just stopped. The only thing that we could hear was the sound of the disc hitting the metal pole. I tried telling my friend, but he didn't seem to notice that all the birds had stopped singing, and everything was dead silent. I couldn't help but feel uneasy and wondered if I was the only one experiencing this. I had heard of this happening before, but never really had it happen to me, especially in a public disc golf course. It wasn't deep or out of the way that one could get lost, and yet it was creepy as fuck. It happened twice during our rounds. The course was on the side of a mountain, and we were playing amidst the wilderness. I've seen deer and other animals watching us from high vantage points before, just chilling, but this was different. The silence was deafening, and it felt like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I tried to shake off the feeling and continue playing, but I couldn't help but feel like we were being watched. Every time we threw a disc, it felt like something was following it, tracking its every move. It was as if the woods had eyes, and that they were fixated on us. After we finished our rounds, I couldn't help but feel relieved that the silence had broke and the birds started singing again. I told my friend about my experience, but he didn't seem to think much of it. However, I couldn't shake off the eerie feeling that had engulfed me during the game. To this day, I'm not sure what caused the silence in the woods that day. Was it just my imagination, or is it something else at play? Either way, it's an experience that I'll never forget, and it's made me more aware of my surroundings while playing disc golf in the wilderness. I sat in the middle of a fairy ring, and this morning I saw this weird entity in my room. So something strange has been happening in my backyard lately. A fairy ring has been growing around the tree. I can't help but feel like there's something magical about it. As someone who knows about the lore behind fairy rings, I was both fascinated and intrigued by this mysterious occurrence. And I must admit, I felt a little daring too. One day I decided to take a chance and see if the lore was true or not. I sat in the fairy ring of mushrooms for about 5 minutes, waiting to see if anything would happen. I didn't really know what to expect, but I was hopeful that something would happen. But alas, nothing did. I got bored and got up, thinking that perhaps the whole thing was just a myth after all. However, the very next morning, something truly remarkable did happen. I woke up to find a black mass just chilling on my ceiling. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before, with multicolored lights that were almost spider-like in appearance. It was there for about 5 minutes, just hanging out before disappearing just as suddenly as it had appeared. What's more, I realized the time frame during which the black mass appeared coincided perfectly with the time frame I'd spent in the fairy ring the previous day. I couldn't believe my eyes. It was almost as if the fairy ring had summoned the black mass. And surely enough, I didn't feel scared or worried about the whole thing. In fact, I felt strangely comforted by the presence of the black mass. It was as if I had been transported to a completely different world, one where magic and mystery were the norm. I mean, who wouldn't want to be abducted by the Fae? I couldn't help but feel like this was a sign that something amazing was about to happen to me. Maybe it's just wishful thinking, but I can't shake the feeling that this is just the beginning of something truly extraordinary. And as crazy as it may sound, I'm almost looking forward to whatever comes next. After all, who needs a 40-hour work week when you can have an adventure with the Fae? Ask Reddit 1, Part 1. When I was 16, my family and I went down to Alabama to visit my relatives who owned a huge amount of land down in Huntsville. My uncle owned a big house and a bunch of trailers that they put out in the woods for hunting or camping. I was a city kid from Chicago, so my cousins teased me about camping in the woods. We collected food, killed a pig and some chickens, and brought necessities to camp out for a few days. When we arrived at the camp, it was obvious that something was weird. There was this strange electric smell in the air, like right before a storm, like ozone. However, we didn't think too much about it, and just unpacked and went down to the little creek to swim for a few hours. All of a sudden, an older white guy and a white teenager came out of the bushes. The guy had a shotgun in the crook of his arm and asked us what we were doing this far back in the woods. I told him about my uncle, who he knew, and said we were out camping. He warned us to be careful and stick together, because there was a big animal in the woods. His son, who was my age, asked if he could stay and hang out with us. His dad said okay. We ended up playing football and digging around for the day. As night fell, we went back to the camp and started to make a fire. Tanner, the white kid, said that his family property sat up against my uncle's, and he wanted to run home and ask his dad if he could come out camping with us. My cousin Rooster said he would go with him since it was getting dark real soon, and one of the girls also wanted to tag along. After about 40 minutes, we started to smell the same strange electric smell again. It was a nasty, coppery smell, like right after we've had a nosebleed, and it stopped. We searched the trailers and found nothing was on, but we could all smell it. All of a sudden, Rooster, Tanner, and the girl all come running into the clearing, out of breath. And they don't even break stride. They all run to the trailer, right by where the fire is. We all get scared and go into the trailers. They end up calming down, but the fire's guttering lower and lower. So my other cousins say fuck it, and are about to go outside to get the generator out of the shed between the trailers. Tanner goes, fuck no. Lock the front door, ain't nobody else getting outside. He's been crying too, and his eyes are bloodshot and puffy, and his pants are dirty as hell. He goes on to tell us that they went up to his house. His father said sure, he could go out camping, but to make sure that they were careful. On the way back, that maybe they should take one of the hunting rifles, just in case. Evidently, Tanner had seen something in their yard a few days before. One of their pigs had come, ripped up and half-eaten. They assumed it was just some big cat or coyote, even though they don't usually mess with live animals. He had gone upstairs and packed his stuff and told his dad that they'd be okay without the rifle because the coyotes avoid people. So they started walking back, where they were camping. Rooster told us that they had gotten halfway into the woods toward the camp when they started to hear shit in the forest. It was almost pitch black by this time, so they weren't sure at first where the fuck it was. The girl says that she heard something in the bushes, right off the trail, and they all beamed flashlights over there, and to their surprise, there was a man standing in the woods, slightly closer to the path. The man had his back turned towards them, and he was just standing there, motionless, in the pitch-black darkness of the woods. They shouted at him and told him that he was scaring them, but he didn't respond or even turn around to face them. They started walking faster, and that's when they started smelling the nasty coppery ozone smell again. As they walked, they could hear a low, gibbering sound coming from both sides of the woods, which only grew louder and louder as they got closer to the campsite. Finally, they saw the light from the campfire, and they just ran towards it as fast as they could. They didn't stop until they reached the trailer and got inside, locking the door behind them. They were all terrified and shaking, and some of them were even crying. As they recounted their experience, the coppery smell still lingered in the air inside the trailer, and they all knew that something was out in the woods. They decided to stay inside the trailer for the rest of the night, huddled together and trying to calm themselves down. The next day, they packed up their things and left the campsite, never looking back. They never found out what it was that they had encountered in the woods that night. But the memory of the gibbering sounds and coppery smell, and the man standing motionless in the darkness, would stay with them forever. Ask Reddit 2, Part 2. I shit you guys not. What I experienced with my cousins and friends in that cabin in the woods was some of the scariest shit I've ever witnessed. We were all there having a good time, not really paying attention to the fact that there were 12 people in the cabin, even though we didn't all know each other that well. It wasn't until later that I realized that there was an extra person in the trailer with us for at least a day, eating with us. I couldn't figure out who it was because nobody had interacted with them or even noticed their presence. The girl, Kiera, had been praying to Jesus, and we all went outside with big-ass sticks to investigate, but there was no one there. We counted again, and there were only 11 people. We went back into the trailer and locked the door, explaining what had happened. Kiera said that she had realized it too, and that when she was about to say something, the extra person had grabbed her leg hard and leaned over toward her, saying something she couldn't even understand. We were all terrified as we huddled together, and eventually, I fell asleep. When I woke up, the sun was just coming up and half the people were asleep and the other half were up packing to leave. Some people still wanted to stay until the sun was all the way up, but I just wanted to get the fuck out of the woods. Kiera said that she didn't want to be out in the woods alone for another night, so we decided to split up. 4 people left, but I had to stay because I had the key to the cabin and I had to lock up. I was super pissed at this point because people weren't taking the situation seriously, and I decided I didn't want to be out in the woods for another night myself. I spent the rest of the day trying to convince the others to leave, but some people still wanted to stay in the woods. Tanner left with the others to go get a rifle and said he would be back. By 4 p.m., there were only 7 of us left in the cabin, and Tanner still hadn't returned. We were all getting extremely fucking antsy, and the only reason I stopped begging them to go back was because Tanner had gone to go get a gun. At around 5 p.m., one of my cousins who had stayed with us said that Kiera was outside by the fire pit with her back to the cabin. I was thinking to myself, why the hell would she come back if she was so scared? And then I got this nasty feeling in my gut. I realized I could smell just a twinge of the coppery smell that had been gone for quite some time now. I told the others what I'd noticed, but they all laughed, and they asked if I set this up to scare them. I asked them why the fuck I would do that, and one of the girls went outside to go get Kiera. She got halfway to her and stopped cold. Kiera started heaving, sort of like if someone with their back turned was laughing without actually making any sound. It was then that I realized there wasn't a fucking sound in the whole woods. It was dead silent. This was in September, and it was usually hot during the day, but chilly at night. You could usually hear big-ass geese honking or some kind of bird or squirrels chit-chatting, but there was no sound at all, and I started to panic. I stepped out of the door and told Kiara to come back in the fucking trailer right goddamn now. She backed up into the trailer, and we locked the fucking door. We pulled down all the shades except for one and put a guy there in a chair to watch her. She stood there for another 20 minutes or so while we all huddled inside, nervously peeking through the shades. It was dead silent outside, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. The only sound we could hear inside the trailer was the rapid beating of our own hearts. Eventually, the guy who was watching her turned to us and whispered that she was still there, standing motionless with her back to the cabin. I couldn't take it anymore and stepped out the door, yelling at her to come back inside right now. She slowly turned around, and as soon as I saw her face, my stomach dropped. It wasn't Kiara. The girl standing outside had the same pale skin and dark hair as Kiara, but her eyes were different. They were completely black, like giant pupils that took up her entire eye socket. She was staring right at me with the same slack-jawed expression, making me feel like I was the only thing in her universe. I could smell that same coppery smell again, only this time it was stronger. It was as if the scent was emanating from her. I yelled at her to leave, but she just stood there, swaying slightly back and forth. It was then that I realized there wasn't a sound in the whole forest. It was eerily quiet with no birds chirping or leaves rustling. All I could hear was the sound of my own breath and the pounding of my heart. I quickly backed into the trailer and locked the door, telling everyone to pull down all the shades except for one, so we could keep an eye on her. We watched her through the window as she continued to stand there, staring blankly into the distance. I remember feeling like she was waiting for something or someone. I didn't know what to do, but I knew that we had to keep her out. After what seemed like an eternity, we heard a loud banging on the door. It was so forceful that the whole trailer shook. We all jumped up, terrified, scrambling to find a place to hide. My cousin was holding on to one of the girls, while the other two were giggling nervously. Tan and I were frozen with fear, not knowing what to do, and then we heard Tan's voice outside, screaming to be let in and to stop fucking around. We all breathed a sigh of relief and quickly opened the door for him. Tan stumbled in, holding a rifle in his hand. He looked shaken and pale, as if he had just seen a ghost. He told us that he had just walked up to the campsite and saw a girl standing there, but it wasn't Kiara. He said she had turned towards him with a slack-jawed look and just stared him down, slowly tracking him as he walked around the outside of the clearing towards the camp. He said that it wasn't until he was almost halfway to the trailer that he realized that she was getting closer to him. She had started off by the fire, and without him even seeing her move, she had been turning, inching closer. He said he just ran the rest of the way back to the cabin thinking it would open, and when he got to the door, it was locked. He turned and it was about halfway distance to the door, and as he finished his story, he looked around the room and then pulled me to his side, whispering in my ear, "You know, there are only 7 of us in here, right?" My heart sank as I realized that he was right. The goat man had slipped back into the trailer while we were out sorting out who was going where, and then when we all went outside to talk earlier in the day, we looked out the window but there was no one out there. So we recounted everyone and realized that there were only 7 of us in the cabin instead of 8. Tan had brought back a couple of boxes of ammo and his rifle, and he had told his dad that there were some kind of animals in the forest. But he didn't think that his dad would believe him if he said that it was a goat man. He said that his cousin was supposed to be coming down for a few hours, and in the morning we could all go back to his place, and his cousin would drive us back home. Now, I was really fucking terrified, but I at least felt better because we could be American and shoot the fuck out of whatever it was if it ever came back. However, my cousin got into a huge argument with one of the girls because she thought that I was trying to be funny and prank them, and that she was getting really scared and that I wasn't funny. He kept telling her that I'm not that kind of person, and she said, "Well, how do we know the girl wasn't just Tanner in a wig? Or if it's really the goat man, how do we know that this is the real Tanner and that goat man just didn't kill Tanner in the woods and take his gun?" So we fucking got into a huge argument about this, where me and Tan were like, we could seriously be in danger because at the very least someone's been sneaking themselves into our fucking trailer without us knowing and mingling with us, and at worst, something bad is in the forest fucking with us. One of the girls was crying and saying that she wanted to go right now, and we were trying to tell her that we shouldn't because none of us were walking through the woods in the middle of the night. At this point, the sun was starting to go down, and it was getting a little cloudy out. We ate something and turned on the radio for a while, but we couldn't really get a station out there with anything decent. So we turned it off. At about the same time, Tan's cousin showed up. He was like 19, I think. And at this point, the sun was just barely over the horizon, and he had one of those heavy-duty lantern flashlights and another rifle. He walked up to the trailer, and we whispered to Tan, asking if he was sure that that was his cousin, and he said yes. The guy looked behind him and all around the camp and then walked in. He kind of glanced at all of us and looked a little confused. He said, "Where's your other little buddy at? I I figured she would meet up at this cabin. Is she a little slow or something? He also asked whether he had been cooking blood in the cabin because it smelt like blood and hot pans all the way up the trail. We were all like, nope. But we asked him what the fuck he was talking about with the girl that he saw. He had come down the same trail Tan had been using, and he had come upon one of Yu's guy's buddies standing in the middle of the trail, looking at him slack-jawed. He had asked her a bunch of questions, but all she said was nothing and just looked at him. Then she smiled at him, and he said he kept walking. She couldn't seem to keep up with him and kept lagging a little bit behind. He said he asked her if she was hurt or something, and if she needed any help, but she just continued to stare. And eventually, he had been walking and turned around a bend of the trail, but when he turned around and went back to see if she was okay, the trail was empty. He'd assumed maybe she had just taken some shortcut through the woods. We told him the whole story of what had been happening, and although we half expected him to say that we were full of shit, he just listened attentively and then sat down on the couches in the living room. We explained that we had noticed an extra person in the cabin who we couldn't identify, and that the girl Kiara had felt someone grab her leg and lean over toward her. But when she turned to look, no one was there. We also recounted how we had all gone outside and seen Kiara standing by the fire pit with her back to the cabin, and how she heaved and laughed without making any sound, while the woods remained eerily silent. Furthermore, we shared with him the encounter that Tanner had with a different girl in the woods who had been staring at him slack-jawed, smiled, and then disappeared. We mentioned the strange coppery smell that had come and gone through the ordeal, and how we were all on edge and worried about what was happening. Tan's cousin listened intently and then suggested that we all stay together for the night and try to get some rest. He also mentioned that he had brought a rifle with him, that he could keep watch throughout the night. We agreed that this was the best course of action and settled down, with everyone huddled together in the living room of the cabin. Despite our fear and anxiety, we managed to drift off to sleep, comforted by the presence of Tan's cousin and the knowledge that we were all together. However, peace was short-lived, as we were awoken in the middle of the night by a loud banging on the cabin door. We all jumped up in terror, unsure of what to do, but Tan's cousin quickly grabbed his rifle and headed toward the door. He cautiously peered out of the peephole and then slowly opened the door, revealing a disheveled and frightened Kiara. She stumbled into the cabin and collapsed onto the couch, shaking and hyperventilating. We all gathered around her, trying to calm her down and find out what had happened. Through sobs and gasps, she recounted how she had been wandering in the woods and had gotten lost. She had been wandering aimlessly for what felt like hours when she suddenly heard the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned around to see a figure in the distance, but it was too dark to make out any details. The figure had started running towards her, and she had panicked and started running as well. She had eventually stumbled upon the cabin and had been relieved to see that the door was unlocked. As she finished her story, we all exchanged nervous glances, realizing that we were all still in grave danger. Despite our fear, we knew that we had to remain calm and come up with a plan to get out of the woods as soon as possible. We decided to wait until dawn and then make a run for it, sticking together and keeping a lookout for any signs of danger. As we waited for the sun to rise, we stayed alert and kept our eyes peeled for any signs of movement or activity outside. Finally, as one of the first rays of light began to filter through the trees, we made our move. We grabbed our things and headed out of the cabin, sticking close together and moving as quickly as we could. As we made our way through the woods, we could feel the weight of the previous night's events still bearing down on us, but we knew that we had to keep moving forward. After what felt like hours, we emerged from the woods and saw the familiar sight of civilization. We all let out a sigh of relief and collapsed onto the ground, exhausted but grateful to be alive. As we looked back into the woods, our hearts racing, we couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The sun was setting, and the woods were becoming increasingly dark and ominous. It was as if the woods were alive and watching us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Tan's cousin seemed to believe our story, but he was also clearly on edge. He told us that we should all stay inside the cabin and keep the doors and windows locked. He also suggested that we should take turns keeping watch throughout the night. As the night wore on, the atmosphere inside the cabin became increasingly tense. We could hear strange noises coming from outside, and every time there was a sudden noise or movement, we all jumped in fear. At around midnight, I was on watch duty, staring out into the darkness. Suddenly, I saw movement in the woods and my heart leapt into my throat. I reached for the rifle and aimed in the direction of the movement. It was then that I saw a pair of eyes staring right back at me from the darkness. They were glowing like the eyes of an animal, but they were much too high off the ground. I raised the rifle and fired a warning shot, hoping to scare off whatever it was, but the eyes didn't move. They just started staring back at me, unblinking. I fired another shot, and this time the eyes disappeared. The rest of the night passed without incident, but none of us were able to sleep. And as soon as the sun rose, we packed up all of our things and left the cabin, vowing to never return to those woods again. To this day, we still don't know what was out there in the woods with us, but we all know that we were lucky to make it out alive. The memory of that night still haunts us. We all avoid going camping or hiking in the woods whenever possible. So let me tell you about the scariest night of my life. It was a few years ago when my cousin Tanner invited me and some other friends to go camping in the woods. We were all excited to get away from the city and have a fun weekend out in the nature, but little did we know we were in for a horrifying experience. It started when Tanner's cousin came back from the girl who had been lagging behind us. He told us that he had tried to keep her in front of him, but she kept lagging behind. He also said that he smelled this really nasty smell, which got stronger as he got closer to the camp. And then something really strange happened. The girl had said something really low that he couldn't catch, and when he turned around, she was right up on him. He stepped back, asked her if she was okay, and reached out to grab her shoulder, but she had moved while he was looking at her. This made us all realize that something was wrong, and we knew it wasn't a prank because Tanner was almost pissing his pants. We loaded up our rifles, ate some more, and just sat around until 11 p.m. And then the stink of copper turned into a gross blood-like smell, like cooking blood or singed hair. Tanner and his cousins, Reese, immediately got up and grabbed their rifles. There was this knocking and clawing at the door, and we heard a voice that sounded like one of those YouTube cats or dogs whose owners teach them how to talk. Let me the fuck in, stop fucking playing. This made my nerves creep up against my body, and one of the girls started crying and calling on Jesus. We kept yelling outside, "Who is this? Stop fucking around, man." But it just kept saying in or let me the fuck in for almost 15 minutes. It sounded like this almost not funny. Just for being on a tangent, but if you can't imagine how this shit sounded, then you can't really imagine how fucked up the whole situation was. For the next hour or so, we could hear someone basically creeping around in the woods. And every couple of minutes, it would come back to the door and say something. At around 2 a.m., Reese said, "Man, fuck this," and opened the door and walked outside with his rifle. He fired a shot into the air and said something to the effect of, "In the name of Jesus Christ, go away." He fired 2 more times. And then from the woods right up against the river across the trailer, it sounded like something was slowly gibbering and hooting. Then it started screaming, and it sounded almost like a woman and a cat in a bag screaming together. It was terrifying. We could hear the brush over that way start to shake. Reese said something had come out of the bushes, super low to the ground and crawling toward the cabin. He had shot at it. Pretty much that was how the rest of the night went. It was literally screaming constantly for the next 2 hours, and we could hear shit moving out in the tree line. But it never came back up to the cabin until everyone had finally fallen asleep. The scariest part of the story came from Tanner. He had been sitting in the chair watching the door with his rifle. Nobody else heard or saw this, and he told me 2 days later. After the whole thing was over, he said that he had been nodding off after screaming and the noises had finally stopped, and he had been almost asleep when he saw someone come out of the bathroom and then lay down in the middle of the room and go to sleep. At this point, I was almost asleep myself, but something felt off. I counted the people in the cabin and realized that there were 9 of us, which was one more than there should have been. I didn't want to risk shooting at the thing and hurting us while causing a panic, so I decided to stay awake all night and keep an eye on it. I watched as it would stand up and do this weird jittery thing or heave like it was laughing before laying back down. It was truly terrifying. In the morning, we all woke up and packed our things to head back to Tan's house. Tan seemed a little bit jittery and avoided looking at us. He stayed last in the cabin and said that he would lock up and bring my uncle's keys. I wasn't thrilled about the idea of walking ahead without him, but we started on the path anyway. When Tan caught up to us, we jogged back to his house and his cousin drove us home. Later, Tan went back to the cabin to lock up and discovered that there was an open window in the bathroom. We had been too stupid to lock the screenless window, and the thing had been waiting for us to slip up and let it in. It had walked with us all the way back to Tan's house and had even looked him dead in the eyes before walking back into the woods. To this day, the memory of that night still haunts me, and I hope to God that it was just all some elaborate prank that my cousins played on me. Why I stopped doing EVPs. Throughout my life, I've had many strange and unexplainable experiences, and it's hard to know where to begin. From full-body shadow apparitions to moving objects and unexplained doors opening and closing, I've seen it all. I've even captured over a dozen Class A EVPs that are so clear you'd swear that they were human voices. But one experience stands out above all the others as the most terrifying thing I've ever encountered. It started with me waking up out of a trance in front of my stove. The burner was on and there was a knife with a plastic handle in the frying pan, the handle melting. I had no idea what had happened or how I ended up there. It wasn't until my girlfriend told me that I'd called her in a state of confusion that I began to piece things together. As I looked around the kitchen, I noticed that there were pieces of food in the freezer with knife slashes all over them. It was like someone or something had taken control of me and used me to destroy things in my own home. But the worst was yet to come. In my bedroom, I discovered a room air cleaner balancing perfectly upside down on its surface. This was impossible to do, and I tried to recreate the feat over a dozen times before and without success. It was as though the spirits were trying to send me a message, one that I didn't understand. For over half an hour, I had no control over myself. I was possessed, and it was the most frightening experience of my life. I started to think about murderers who claimed to black out while committing heinous crimes, and wondered if they were telling the truth. I couldn't shake the feeling that true evil existed, and it scared me to my core. What if my mother or someone else I loved had been in the house with me that day? What would I have done? The spirits seemed to be trying to tell me that I should be scared. For the first time in my life, I listened to them. Ghost in my house. When I was around 12 years old, I had an experience that I'll never forget. It was a night that my dad was on a hunting trip and my mom was asleep in their bedroom. I was in my room playing Xbox, and I was the only one up in the house. At the time, I was always into creepy stuff, but not necessarily ghosts or anything like that. As I was playing my game, I started feeling like there was a presence in the room with me, or someone was watching me. It was a strange feeling that I couldn't quite shake off. Eventually, I paused my game and decided to look into the hallway from my room. That's when I saw it, a transparent mass that floated past my door. Now, normally, I would have thought that it was maybe just me seeing things, or was my mind playing tricks on me. But the thing that made this experience so creepy was that there was a grave in the woods about 80 or 100 yards from my house. The grave had dates 1803 through 1900 on it, and I had always wondered if that had something to do with what I had just witnessed. I remember feeling a sense of fear and unease wash over me as I tried to process what I had just seen. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the atmosphere in the living room had suddenly changed. It was as if the air had become heavy and oppressive. Even though I was a kid, I knew that something strange was happening, and it terrified me. Looking back on that experience now, I can't help but wonder if it was a ghost or some kind of paranormal activity. I've heard countless stories about people encountering ghosts and spirits, but I never thought it would happen to me. But now I can't identify what I saw that night, and I can't deny that I saw it. It was a strange and unsettling experience that has stayed with me all these years. When I was 12, my family had a paranormal experience. When I was 12 years old, my family experienced a paranormal event that, till this day, I can't rationalize. It was one of the most frightening experiences of my life, and I remember it vividly, even though it happened 14 years ago. We were staying at my aunt's house, where my mom and I lived at the time, along with my aunt, her two sons, E and D, and E's girlfriend, Cass, KP, D's best friend, and KP's girlfriend, C. My great-grandfather, Mawmaw, was also staying with us for the weekend. My family often discussed paranormal topics. It was a common theme in our conversations. My mom mentioned that she sleeps facing the back of the couch because she sees things if she doesn't. We asked her what she sees, and she said that she sees faces in the curtains, over the windows, and shadows on the ceiling. Cass also said that she sees things when she closes her eyes. And we were all intrigued. She explained that she gets flashes of pictures, but only when she's out of the house. We asked her what she saw. She closed her eyes to tell us. This is when things started to get really strange. I remember being terrified, as it was midnight and I was only 12 years old. I don't recall how we started doing these things, but we did do them. I was so scared and I never forgot it. In my family, we had a belief that there is a way to see if a ghost or spirit has a good or bad intention. If you're confronted with such things, you simply ask them, in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, what do you want? If it has good intentions, it'll give you a sign or speak to you. However, if it has bad intentions, it will vanish, disappear, or leave you alone, which is a temporary banishment to give you time to sort things out, to give you a break to think about your next steps. In the living room, Cass was sitting on a big overstuffed armchair, which was big enough for two people. My mom was sitting on the arm of the chair, and E was sitting on the other arm. Cass closed her eyes to tell us what she saw, and my mom grabbed her arm and looked straight ahead, unmoving. We were all confused as Cass opened her eyes and looked at my mom. She was not moving at all. She was frozen. I was so confused because I didn't know what was happening. Then I saw my mom's lips start to tremble, and tears slid down her cheek. I became scared because my mom doesn't just cry out of nowhere. I only seen my mom cry a handful of times, and to see her unmoving, crying, and not speaking was frightening. I said to the room, "Someone say it." No one moved or spoke. I said it louder. "Someone say it." It snapped my aunt out of her stupor, and she looked at my mom with intention and said with sternness, "In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, what do you want?" My mother collapsed into Cass's arms and sobbed. We all asked her what happened, but all she could say was that she didn't know. She couldn't move, and she was frozen. Suddenly we heard D gasp from the couch, and we looked over to see him covered in scratches on his back and chest. We were all staring at my mom, and no one knew how those scratches appeared, but they were there, big, red, angry scratch marks. Then we heard heavy footsteps running down the wooden porch steps outside, which sent shivers down my spine. I paused, my heart racing, and listened as the footsteps approached the front door. The sound of someone fumbling with the doorknob filled the air, and I realized with horror that the door was unlocked. Without thinking, I scrambled off the couch and darted into the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the back of the counter. I huddled behind the kitchen island, my hand shaking as I held the knife tightly. Suddenly, the door swung open with a loud bang, and a tall, imposing figure filled the doorway. For a moment, my mind went blank with fear, but then I realized that it was just my neighbor who had come home to borrow a cup of sugar. I let out a sigh of relief and put down the knife, feeling foolish for just having been so scared. My neighbor looked at me quizzically, but I just smiled and handed over the sugar, trying to act as if nothing were wrong. The Devil by the River. When I was 12 years old, my older brother and I went to visit family in Colombia in the summer of 2004. We had a lot of freedom and often played with the neighborhood kids outside, and that was during the day, and we would go back for evenings and dinner. One day, we decided to go for a walk around the river that was behind the apartments where we were staying. We had heard that the river was haunted by La Llorona, a Hispanic urban legend about a woman who drowned her children and would cry in agony at night, mourning for them. Although we were slightly spooked about the urban legend, we decided to go anyway since it was broad daylight. After about 5 minutes of walking around and throwing rocks at nearby trees, something terrifying happened. I turned around and saw my friend Santiago's face in utter shock, and both my brother and his friend screamed, "What the hell is that? Do you see that?" I was too scared to turn and see what they were talking about, but I could hear the fear in their voices. Suddenly, Santiago and my brother were running ahead of me, and I didn't want to be left behind. We made it to the street and escaped whatever it was that scared them so badly. When I finally asked what had happened, they both described seeing a demonic creature hanging from a tree, smiling at them. They both confirmed the same description, and luckily, I didn't lay eyes on it at all. I couldn't believe that they had seen something so terrifying, but I assumed that they were trying to scare me. As time went on, I became more and more convinced that they had seen something real. Even now, at 26 years old, I sometimes ask my brother about the incident. At first, he was hesitant to confirm or deny what he saw, but eventually he admitted that it was the real deal. Looking back, I'm grateful that I didn't see whatever that scared my brother and Santiago so badly. Was told to post this here, so here's my experience. I have a story to tell that happened to me and my cousin back in 2020. It all started after my grandfather passed away, leaving his house completely empty. He passed away inside the house, but he left behind his loyal dog, which would often run away from its new owner to return to my grandparents' house. The house was just down the road from ours. It wasn't much of a problem. We occasionally let the dog in the house so we could feel at home. And one day, my cousin and I decided to stay the night at my grandfather's house. We hung out and played some card games for a while until we heard 3 knocks on the outside of the front door. At first, we thought someone was at the door, so we answered it, but no one was there. We looked outside, but there were no cars in the driveway either. The dog came from the other room barking, so we knew it wasn't just us. It was strange, but we didn't think much of it and we went back to our games. The next day, I told my brother about what had happened, and he informed me that my grandfather always knocked 3 times. He even demonstrated the knocks, and it sounded just like the ones we heard the night before. I was taken back, realizing that it might have been my grandfather's ghost knocking on the door. I couldn't explain it, but I had a feeling that it was him trying to communicate with us. Maybe to mess with us or scare us, or maybe just to let us know that he was just still around. My grandparents were heavy smokers, and occasionally I would smell cigarette smoke in the house, even though no one had smoked there. I take that as a sign that my grandparents are near me, watching over me and letting me know that they're still around. Overall, the experience was spooky yet comforting. It made me realize that there might be something beyond our physical world, something that we can't always explain or see, While it may be scary to think about, it's also fascinating and awe-inspiring to consider the possibility that our loved ones might still be with us, even after they've passed away. Sleepover at a haunted house. I remember my one and only paranormal experience like it was yesterday, even though it happened over a decade ago when I was only 10 years old. It was a night that I stayed over at a friend's house whom I wasn't particularly close with. She was a relative of my neighbor who was a family friend, so I only stayed at the house one night. Her and her mother were aware that their house was haunted, and the story that the girl told me was quite chilling. Apparently, a 14-year-old boy was murdered on the staircase, and his ghost still lingered in the house. The first thing I noticed was the cold spot on the stairs that her dog always laid on. I could feel the difference in temperature myself when I moved my hand from one side of that stair to the other. She also showed me that a cold burst of air would come back at you when you opened her bedroom door, which opened inward into the room. I remember feeling that cold burst of air at the time that she showed me. The TV channels would change by themselves, and even the voices of people talking would change. And when I was there, the TV channels did change by themselves, but I didn't experience the voice thing. However, the main aspect of the whole paranormal experience that really stuck with me throughout the years happened the next day after spending the night. I was sitting in the living room talking to my friend and her mom, and in between the dining room and the living room, there was a shelf that was built into the wall that I was sitting perpendicular to. Then suddenly a plastic duck figurine that was sitting on the shelf flew off and hit the wall in front of it. It was as if someone had smacked it off the top shelf, and it definitely didn't just fall. It was absolutely gobsmacked, while her mom was just like, "Oh yeah, that's the ghost," and they were both completely unfazed. My aunt had also lived in the same house prior to them living there and claimed that the house was haunted, although I don't remember what she told me about her experiences. I don't see her very often, but the next time I do, I'd like to ask her more about it, even though I haven't had any significant experiences that I would claim to be paranormal since then. I'm still a firm believer in the paranormal, just from that one night in that house. Sleep paralysis experience. It's been years since this happened, but I still remember it like it was yesterday. I was sleeping peacefully when I suddenly woke up to find myself unable to move. I knew immediately that I was in sleep paralysis, but it was still a terrifying experience. And then it got even worse. I heard a voice, a sinister voice that sent shivers down my spine. "I'm gonna get you, John," it said, before breaking out into a fit of laughter. I couldn't move or even scream for help. I was completely at its mercy. Thankfully, I managed to snap out of it eventually, but the experience left me shaken and disturbed. What did that voice mean? Who was John, and why was it after him? I didn't have any answers, and the more I thought about it, the more scared I became. The next day, I woke up feeling sick and decided to stay home from school. I thought it was just a case of the flu or something, but it turned out to be much worse. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my stomach, and it was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. I was writhing in pain and couldn't sit still. I was rushed to the hospital, where I found out that my appendix had burst. It was a life-threatening situation, and I needed emergency surgery to remove it. Thankfully, the surgery was a success, and I made a full recovery. But the whole experience left me wondering if there's a connection between the sleep paralysis and the burst appendix. Was something trying to get me, as the voice had said? Was it all just a coincidence? I may never know for sure, but I'm just glad I made it out alive. Creepy experience. Back when I was in primary school, I had an unexplainable experience that still haunts me to this day. It happened during my last year of primary school when I was around 10 or 11 years old. I was sitting in class with a friend, and our seats were facing the window. From where we were sitting, we could see some of the houses in the street that backed up right against the wall of the school grounds. There was a particular house that we could see from the side entrance of the school, which had been abandoned and was in a state of disrepair. It had boarded up windows, chains, and locks on the door, and an overgrown garden. It was clearly not lived in anymore. One recent school day, my friend and I saw something that we couldn't explain. We saw a man dressed in a pristine white suit, a wide hat to match, and a white tie. His face was in the shadows, so we couldn't see what he looked like. We both saw him, and then he took a half step directly backwards and seemed to vanish into thin air. The moment felt so creepy, put shivers down my spine. But wait, it gets even creepier. The following week, a machete was found in the woodlands, which was fenced-off wooded area on school grounds used for nature lessons. It was like the Forbidden Forest in Harry Potter, but much more sinister. The knife was big and covered in blood, and it had been stabbed through a tree. The police were all over the school, but nothing else was ever found. I still don't know what happened or if these two incidents were linked, but it was one of the creepiest experiences of my life, and it makes me wonder what other unexplainable things are out there that we can't see or understand.